My name is Marcus Alleyne. I've lived in Cornwall for 26 years now, having moved down from the Midlands. I am by trade, I guess, a full-time musician, working with choirs and orchestras and theatre companies across the county. But most recently, I now sit as one of five executive directors for a new organisation called Black Voices Cornwall, who are looking to challenge and tackle racism and bias within the county, but also to try and bring some, I guess, accountability and challenge to some of the big organisations who we're hoping can make some real positive impact on the diverse communities we've got in the county.
Yes, well, thank you so much for that. Do you see a lot of racism and bias in Cornwall?
Yes, I think is the short answer. But it racism and bias. It looks very different to what it used to look like. For example, when I first moved to the county, where it was quite overt, it was quite obvious, and people weren't too concerned to, I guess, voice that bias and that discrimination. Whereas now we're seeing it on, I think, a much bigger scale, but it's what we're kind of considering to be more of a microaggressive form of racism. So it's the kind of the stares and the looks, or the kind of just being followed around a store or a shop, more so than a kind of my white colleagues might be. It's things like not considering the cultural diversity we have when it comes to education, and even though that's not, it's not being racist, but it's not being inclusive, and I think that exclusivity, being exclusive, or excluding diverse communities is, I think, can be equally as damaging as walking down the street and calling someone the N word, or being really abusive. So yeah, we are still seeing it in Cornwall, and I think it's just taken on a different form. We had those recent statistics from Assistant Chief Constable Jim Colwell, looking at the disproportionality in the stops and searches, and the arrest rates, and the kind of COVID fines, etc. And those results in themselves were quite damning. So like 12 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. So even though, again, yeah, like I said, we're not seeing those massive overt acts of racism, but it is the microaggressions, it is the bias, whether it's unconscious or conscious, that we need to start addressing. Equal opportunities in the workplace, for example. So there's lots of things that we, particularly as Black Voices Cornwall as an organisation, are trying to kind of bring that accountability and challenge to try and, to try and make those positive changes that we need.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for explaining that. I mean, obviously, everybody experiences racism in a different way, but you mentioned the impact of that, and you mentioned the way that it's become microaggressive, which sounds really disturbing. The fact that it's not as overt as perhaps it used to be before, but that can have such a huge impact. I mean, what's your own experience of that? How does it feel to be
I
on the receiving end of that?
I think the microaggressive form of racism is far more damaging than the big overt acts of racial discrimination. I guess my first real, I guess, experience was, I was working in one of our local Cornish primary schools, and I had a parent of one of the children who just kind of, I'd been having issues with this particular individual for some time, pretty much from the day we moved into the village, and it wasn't until I was in my kind of late teens, early 20s, when I was working at the primary school, that it really kind of came to a head, where we just came into the playground in front of a class of 30 children that were 6 and 7 years old, and actually physically assaulted me in front of a class of children, one of which was his own child. And he said, "Stay away from my kid, you effing N." Okay,
No.
so that was kind of, I guess, one of the biggest, kind of overt, if we're going to use the term, acts of racism. But oddly enough, I knew exactly where I stood. I knew exactly what he thought of me, I knew exactly what the relationship was between he and I was able to manage and negotiate that in an appropriate way. But with the microaggressive forms of racism, it's really difficult to know where you stand. It's always leaving that question: is it because I'm a person of color? Is it because I belong to a minority community? Is it because he just doesn't look like that I'm wearing jeans and flip flops? You know, so it's leaving that question, and when you have those big overt acts of racism, you can deal with that immediately. But when you're left questioning, actually, why was he doing this? Why was she doing this? Why did they speak to me in that way? Why did they not give me that promotion? And we're left with all these questions, and that becomes a real burden. And to kind of have to carry that round for many of us for our entire lives. It doesn't matter where we seem to go. There's always going to be someone that has this opinion or this judgment or this assumption of you as an individual of colour. So for me personally, I would much rather someone kind of be very frank about their biases or their assumptions of a person of colour, rather than someone trying to wrap it into something that it's not. And I guess what we're kind of trying to do as an organisation is to look a little bit deeper into some of those unconscious bias and those microaggressions and try and unravel those and kind of make people aware and enable people to recognise them, what they look like, what effects do they have, and how can we kind of as individuals try and educate people, I guess, to not carry around those microaggressions or those unconscious bias.
Yes. Do you think that the problem is and could be even worse in Cornwall because we're not as diverse as other regions of the UK?
Yeah, this is always a real contentious topic with kind of being in Cornwall. We've got a couple of different camps, I guess, where some opinions and can be generated. One of which is that we're a hotspot for tourism, and as a Cornish resident, we've all been driving down the A30 in the middle of summer, and it's been an absolute nightmare. And we've all had those few choice words in the car about the number of tourists that are clogging up our roads. So that's kind of one thing where we're looking at huge groups of people coming into the county, and the effects that has on the local residents, and that kind of creates its own set of assumptions and bias. When we then add into that mix, groups of people that kind of look different or have slightly different cultural beliefs or practices, we're then confronted with huge groups of people coming into our county, cluttering up the roads, but then also they're coming into our county and they might look differently, they might dress differently, and there might not be a huge amount of understanding or recognition that actually they do come from a different cultural background. They do have their own kind of ethnic and cultural beliefs. I think because we are so underrepresented as a minority in Cornwall it's almost understandable that being confronted with different cultural beliefs and people of colour, it's going to raise a couple of questions for the non people of colour. But I think what it is, it's important that those questions don't turn into bias.
Yes.
So it's really important that we are comfortable to ask questions and not just assume, because it could be a really simple thing, on a beach in the middle of August and there might be someone that is wearing a hijab. Straight away people are going to be either mocking that or questioning that, or kind of assuming, why the hell would you wear that on a beach in the middle of summer? And
isn't it sad though that we are as a society in that situation now? And I guess that's one of the reasons why you are Black Voices Cornwall has been set up to try to combat and to try to raise awareness of the fact that we are all the same. We need to try to get over that bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious. So, I mean, how do you go about trying to do that? I mean, it's a huge task, but it should be so unnecessary. We shouldn't even be talking about it.
No, we shouldn't, but I'm really thankful that we are, because within Black Voices Cornwall, we've got three, I guess, fundamental aspects of the work we do. It's education, communication, and unification, and each within their own right are vital tools that we have as an organisation that can hopefully mean that over time, and this isn't going to happen overnight, we've been experiencing prejudice and bias as people of colour for hundreds of years. So it's going to take time. It's going to take time, but education is key. It's being able to communicate with people that actually this is why this individual might be wearing a hijab or a headscarf or any other item of cultural clothing, just so they can at least understand why someone might look different or dress different or speak differently. Education has to start at a really early age. That there's, children in schools, particularly here in Cornwall, and we've experienced this firsthand as an organisation, that have never seen a person of colour in real life. And that's kind of understandable when out of the community that we have as a whole, people of colour or ethnic minorities only represent 2% of that. So it's okay that when you go into the middle of a real, rural Cornish primary school, that they may not have experienced that. But why aren't they experiencing people of colour within their curriculum? So this is the question that I would be
Yes.
wanting to ask. What's stopping you from actually showcasing professionals or people of excellence that come from a different background or different ethnicity or different culture? So it's about kind of getting in ground roots and teaching our young people and young children actually that there is a much wider world outside of that tiny little village, and that's definitely a
Brilliant.
starting.
And
And that just kind of brings everything together. It brings us together and enables us to be unified and be one race, which is really important to kind of try and get across.
great. And so Black Voices Cornwall very much, you've got, you recently had a very successful education campaign and so on. And I know that you have lots of plans for the future, don't you?
We do. We are incredibly fortunate and really proud that we've been able to make some really great partnerships as well in the short time we've been functioning. We're doing some fantastic work with the NHS Cornwall Foundation Trust at the moment, where we are delivering a 1-year package program, all about inclusion, diversity, and equality. And we started that back in January, and that's going tremendously well. We are looking at creating similar packages of work and training and development with Devon and Cornwall Police and Dorset Police, who have also got a massive drive on actually addressing some of the issues, particularly though those were released with the statistics later last year. We are still working really closely with a number of schools and education settings to kind of start building up their resources and their curriculum packages so they can include people of colour and people from different backgrounds. And we're really excited to be looking at some of the arts and culture venues that we've got in Cornwall and kind of building up that partnership. But we're also really mindful that when we're talking about minorities and ethnic minorities, that actually within Cornwall we've got Cornish nationals who are proud and rightfully proud to be Cornish and have that Cornish heritage and that Cornish culture and to be able to celebrate that. And it's kind of making people recognise that actually you don't just need to look like me to be considered a minority. And for those that are listening, I'm a
Yes,
person of colour, just for the clarification. And we've got people that might be from, I don't know, countries in Europe, for example. We've got people from Poland who are still considered an ethnic minority. We've got the Romani Gypsies and the traveller communities in Cornwall, you know, who walking down the street, you might even not recognise that they belong to an ethnic minority community. So we come in all different shapes and sizes and shades, and once we kind of get our head around that, I think it's definitely going to make for a brighter, better Cornwall.
Certainly. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant.